Hi, all. My name is Anna, and I'll be speaking about our work with advanced energy economy. A special thanks to our faculty advisor, Professor Gray, to our student managers, Annika and Elise, and to the entirety of the workshop team. Thank you all so much. Over the course of this semester, our team has sought to understand and accelerate the deployment of electric school buses, especially with vehicle-to-grid capability in Texas, Arizona, and Florida. I'll start by discussing our client and our approach. I'll provide some background in terms of the underlying technologies. I'll talk about our subject states and the barriers they face. I'll highlight the transformative potential already being realized through the application of these assets, and I'll conclude by reviewing our proposed framework for financial and policy consideration. Advanced Energy Economy is a national trade association representing more than 100 companies and millions of workers, and they're making our energy systems cleaner and more secure and more affordable through their advocacy on behalf of advanced energy businesses. We've been tasked with supporting their efforts to help their clients in the electric school bus industry break into a handful of particularly challenging markets. Our team initially tackled the multidisciplinary challenges of this project by splitting into a handful of groups. But as we synthesize disparate components into a cohesive narrative, our work has become increasingly interconnected. So policy incentives can accelerate the financial momentum behind market growth, and market growth can inspire stronger policy. Climate disasters undermine grid infrastructure, and poorly designed grids make these disasters worse. And understanding the intersection of all these dynamics is a collaborative process. Much of our work has been in secondary research, but we've conducted a handful of interviews with industry insiders and experts, and we performed original analysis with environmental and financial data for final output. Our subject states are relatively large with strong markets for private electric vehicles, but they have yet to fully capitalize on electrification and vehicle-to-grid opportunities. Statewide incentives have been poorly targeted, support from utilities piecemeal and fragmented, and while a handful of statewide projects show promise, the broader regulatory environment in these markets has proven inhospitable. Texas and Florida face flooding and climate-induced grid disruptions. Arizona and Florida have highly regulated and centralized utility structures, and all three states face intense summer heat that can inhibit the operations of buses. We have to be attentive to a whole range of issues if we're going to offer up effective solutions. Vehicle-to-grid is an emerging technological application that functions just how it sounds. When an electric vehicle is plugged into a bidirectional charger at a utility-approved interconnection point, it can not only receive electricity from the grid, but act as a battery and store and transmit that electricity back to the grid when it's useful to do so. If Texas, Arizona, and Florida were able to replace their old diesel school bus fleets with energy-exporting electric models, they could extend their grid capacity by nearly 10,000 megawatt hours, which is enough to power for a day nearly 200,000 homes. On a more local level, these buses can keep the lights on in community resilience centers through the grid disruptions that climate disasters bring. And the flexibility afforded by vehicle-to-grid makes it easier to incorporate intermittent renewable sources into our energy mix. School buses are the perfect source of dispatchable power. They have large batteries which can be emptied and filled more quickly than conventional energy storage. They're often idle since they're usually only in use twice per day, and these trips that they're taking are during off-peak hours when grids need less support. They're especially useful in our subject states where energy demand peaks during the summer when schools are out. And finally, the emissions of diesel school buses have been linked with health conditions among children nationwide. So let's upgrade. Schools across the country are saving money on fuel and maintenance while mitigating local air and noise pollution by electrifying their transit fleets. And when these buses are able to send excess power back to the grid, like in Beverly, Massachusetts, our energy infrastructure becomes more flexible and more resilient. While a growing list of projects demonstrate the promise of this approach, building sustainable market growth in our subject states will require the careful application of policy and financial tools. Many barriers to the adoption of electric school buses are shared between our subject states. The most common issue are the high upfront costs of acquiring these assets. Progress is also slowed by limited awareness both of the potential of electrification and of the pathways to achieving it. Existing rate structures, grid interconnection systems, and electricity export regulations were not designed to accommodate vehicle to grid, and zoning and permitting requirements further contribute to the administrative burden. Exacerbating all these challenges, stakeholders are insufficiently motivated to coordinate their activities. Electric school buses cost more than their diesel alternatives. Our goal is to shrink this gap as much as possible while highlighting the exclusive benefits that electrification offers. Our financial approach has 3 prongs. First, schools can apply for grants and rebates from governments and utilities. Grants award funds directly, while rebates compensate schools retroactively for their investments. Several programs at the federal level, especially the EPA's Clean School Bus Program and the Volkswagen Settlement Fund, have been instrumental in fleet upgrades nationwide. However, less than 15% of the necessary support is expected to come from the federal government, and states have yet to take an active role in planning and financing. Likewise, utility in our subject states have to date focused on private electric vehicles and residential charging systems as opposed to schools. Second, schools can work directly with private actors. For example, third-party buses as a service providers such as Highland Electric offer a turnkey subscription-based model for fleet acquisition and energy export management. Alternately, utilities and grid operators may offer schools specialized compensation in return for support in shaving peak demand, regulating frequency, maintaining a load balance, and in deferring expensive infrastructure investments. And third, financing through debt instruments such as municipal bonds would be congruent with the conventional budgetary strategies of schools. And while green banks do not yet have a strong presence in these markets, the support of climate-oriented monetary institutions would be a game changer. And finally, from a policy perspective, there are 5 steps to selling electric school buses. First, identify, quantify, and communicate the benefits to schools and utilities. These are massive investments financially and logistically, and all parties need to be confident that it's worthwhile. Second, create actionable plans with measurable goals along realistic timeframes. When schools commit to electrification, or states lay out their plans for grid modernization, or utilities set targets for their pilot programs, these actors are able to align their strategies. Third, lay the foundations for strong partnerships. Schools can work with utilities and commercial actors like Highland Electric to acquire buses, and utilities and states can work with commercial actors to explore vehicle-to-grid opportunities. Fourth, tailor incentives with clear and consistent requirements, streamlined application processes, strong informational initiatives, and statewide reach. In our subject states, this is not likely to manifest. But we're hoping to both maximize the utilization of existing incentives and to appeal to lawmakers and utilities for additional support. And fifth, ease the regulatory burden associated with these projects. We want to make it as easy as possible for schools to seek financial assistance, to get interconnection access approved by utilities, bless you, and to comply with permitting regulations and local ordinances. We also want to make it as easy as possible or as profitable as possible for utilities and commercial actors to help. Oh, thank you.
That was fantastic, Anna. Thank you. I was curious about when you were talking about the private partners like Highland Electric. Is that like an independent power provider that basically invests in the buses to be able to profit off of them, like when they're providing electricity to the grid, and then the schools get to use them when they need to bus children?
Yeah, no, I think you've described it pretty perfectly. The idea is that Highland owns the buses, they own a lot of the infrastructure, they fund a lot of this stuff, and then the school pays a subscription on a regular basis to keep accessing these services. And this makes it substantially more affordable for schools to do so because they don't have to deal with the extremely high upfront costs associated with this. They can just pay on a consistent basis the subscription.
Hey, Anna. Really good presentation. I was just curious. I believe you said that the batteries in the buses are charged faster than normal electric vehicles, and I would just believe that it would be slower since they're larger vehicles. So I just was curious how that works.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What I think I meant to articulate is that electric school buses and I think electric vehicles in general can be emptied and filled. Their batteries can be emptied and filled more quickly than conventional energy storage infrastructure. So the kinds of things that utilities would use, where they have to ramp up these big generators or energy storage units for them to be able to dispatch this power to the grid when it's useful. These electric school buses are much faster at dispensing it. And I think that would go for other electric vehicles as well, if you could get them in sufficient quantities.
Great job. Okay. Yeah. So the bidirectional charging stations are very important in this case. How do you coordinate the efforts between schools and utilities to make sure that that part of the value is realized in time?
Yeah, I mean, so the answer is that it's really complicated. So I mean, there are tons of precedent for partnerships between utilities and schools. You can look no further than in Beverly, Massachusetts, where the community was able to work with the local grid, the national grid of New England, and these schools need support for these kinds of infrastructure because they're pretty expensive. They're pretty involved logistically. They're pretty technically complicated in terms of getting everything working out with the utility. And so it does require a significant amount of collaboration, from third-party actors, but especially between the utilities and schools with regard to the charging infrastructure.
So one of the benefits that you mentioned was the fact that even though the upfront cost is higher, the total lifetime cost for an electric vehicle is lower. But then a big part of your pitch was vehicle to grid, which would increase the battery cycling and reduces the lifetime. So I was curious if you did any analysis to sort of determine how much value you lose off of your by having a reduced lifetime, and does it still make it economical, or is it, how big of a loss are you taking by doing vehicle to grid essentially?
That's a great question. That's a very piercing question. And so this is something. It's kind of an unresolved question to date because it's something that utility commissions and private actors are looking into. They want to get a better understanding of what happens to these batteries through extended use for these purposes, and we don't really know. The preliminary results from, for example, a collaboration between Pecan Street, which is a consulting firm in Austin, and Austin Shines, which is a utility-sponsored initiative, has demonstrated that there has been really limited battery degradation, which has been a really significant concern. And so, fingers crossed. But I think you're absolutely right to point out that is something that could be a problem as we try to roll these out on a greater scale.